On September 28th, 2022, NOAA deployed their Hurricane Hunter aircraft into Hurricane Ian off Florida's coastline.
That eyewall specifically had more lightning than I've ever seen on a single flight.
As it penetrated the eyewall, the crew on board started to notice this as a rougher than normal flight.
It also had the most turbulence.
And that's when Nick Underwood started recording on his phone. Over the next 10 minutes, this would become the most turbulent flight most of the crew had ever experienced. In the video, you can hear some nervous laughter as the ride starts to get a little wild.
Normally, when you pass through an eyewall, it's a couple of minutes, you break out into the eye. All right, that was fun. Let's collect the data. We need to get back out the other side. We were in this eyewall for 10 minutes.
Nick comments on the radio sondes rolling around on the floor. Those are the instrument packs that are dropped out of the plane to take measurements inside the hurricane.
Oh, there goes the sondes. We're all right.
At one point, the bunks in the back of the plane fall down from where they're stowed.
There goes the beds. Holy cow.
And it wasn't just the up and down turbulence, but there was a lot of rocks to the side, which are not as common and are certainly much more uncomfortable.
You got it coming out of this.
And then, a sudden jolt.
Oh! You good back there? Yeah, we're good.
That flight, that turbulence, and that one bump in particular prompted one of the scientists on the plane to create a new way to quantify just how turbulent these flights and hurricanes can get.
We created this equation, and then we applied this equation to every flight into a hurricane since 2012, and we ranked them based on the maximum bumpiness experienced in a flight. And that flight, Hurricane Ian, 2022, came out as the bumpiest flight over that time frame.
Today we are going off the radar with both the man who took that video as well as the scientist that created a new equation to better understand bumpy flights. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie, and you're listening to Off the Radar, a production of the National Weather Desk. On the show, we dig deep into topics about weather, climate, the ocean, space, and much more. Our goal is to help you better understand the weather and to love it as much as we do. Welcome to Off the Radar. I'm your host, Emily Gracie. Today's episode is all about aviation turbulence, but not commercial aircraft. We're talking about those planes that fly into hurricanes. And I know what you're thinking. Those flights are supposed to be bumpy, right? Well, no one gets on a Hurricane Hunter and thinks they'll enjoy a full cup of hot coffee the entire flight. But one flight in 2022 was particularly bad. So much so, in fact, that it prompted Dr. Josh Wadler, who was on the flight, to study reconnaissance flights of the past to see how this one compared. Dr. Wadler recently presented his findings at the Tropical Conference of the American Meteorological Society, and I'm going to talk to him today about his findings. Speaking of AMS meetings, I want to give a shout out to all the great people I met a couple of weeks ago at the AMS Broadcast Conference in Myrtle Beach. It was a bit of a whirlwind because I was one of the organizers this year, but it was also very rewarding, and I got to catch up with a lot of old friends and meet a lot of new friends. Other meteorologists doing great work in the field, many of whom I plan to have on the show in future episodes. One other project I've been working on this spring with Jay Mishkin from the National Weather Desk is Sinclair's Hurricane Special. It was just released and will be airing in many markets around the country, but the easiest way that you can find it is on YouTube. Just search up the National Weather Desk and be sure to hit subscribe to our channel while you're there. All right, let's get to today's episode. Before we hear from Dr. Wadler, let's get that first-hand account from the man that took the video from inside Hurricane Ian, Nick Underwood. Nick Underwood, thank you so much for coming on today. This is great to talk to you. I feel like a lot of your videos have really gone viral over the past several years. So it's good to get the inside view and a little behind the scenes look at what's been going on here. You are a hurricane hunter, correct?
That's correct, yes.
And you work with NOAA because there's different hurricane hunters. There's the Air Force ones, but you're with NOAA.
Correct. So there's two different outfits. So there's the 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron. Those are the Air Force folks. And then there's the NOAA Aircraft Operations Center, more commonly known as the NOAA Hurricane Hunters. And so we fly different aircraft, but we're both entities are in the storm collecting data, getting all of that to the forecast models.
Okay, and then there's different rules once you're on the plane too, because there's like meteorologist, there's the pilot, you're an engineer. What does that mean?
Yeah, so there's usually about 12 to 15 folks aboard one of our P3s when we fly through a storm. And so that includes pilots, flight engineers, meteorologists, navigators, electronics technicians, engineers like myself. My job on the aircraft is typically to launch expendables out of the aircraft. So our dropsons, our ocean sensing instruments, our uncrewed aerial systems, anything that's leaving the aircraft, I'm one of the people that does that.
Okay, so let's talk about kind of some momentous flights that you've been on. And one of them, obviously, that stands out is Ian, because this video from a couple years ago was kind of wild. And I feel like it's kind of coming back around because Turbulence has become the big talker again with some of the incidents that have been going on with commercial aircraft. So can you take me through that day in September of 2022 when you were flying into Ian, and maybe jog our memories a little bit too with Ian, and just how destructive it was when it did make landfall?
Yeah, so the video and the flight you're talking about was our crew's last flight into Hurricane Ian. And so Ian was rapidly intensifying over the Gulf of Mexico. It just come off the coast of Cuba. It was working its way towards the coast of Florida. Our crew had redeployed from Florida to Texas because we try to stay out of the way of the storm until we actually go and fly through it. And so that morning, it was a night mission. We'd woke up at, we'd started briefing at 2 a.m. and we had a 4 a.m. takeoff. And so I was part of the group just getting the drone ready on the aircraft, as well as doing some other pre-flight stuff. We flew out. It took us about 90 minutes to get out to where the storm was. And we started our first pass through. And at this time, it was rapidly intensifying. And Air Force C-130 had been out there a little bit earlier than us. And they had just passed through the northwestern eyewall and did not have a good time. And the way storms rotate, all of that nastiness was now coming down to the west side where we were going through.
Were you getting communication at this point with them? Like, did they let you know?
Yeah, we try to talk to each other as much as we can out there to share information, especially like where we're at, what we're planning to do. That way we can kind of deconflict where we're at in the storm, so we're not dropping dropsons on each other or getting in each other's way. And so we started our pass through. It was west to east. Ian was a pretty big storm, pretty sizable, so it took us a little while just to get to where the eyewall was. But that eyewall specifically had more lightning than I've ever seen on a single flight in my 8 years doing this. It also had the most turbulence. And normally when you pass through an eyewall, it's a couple of minutes, you break out into the eye. All right, that was fun. Let's collect the data we need to get back out the other side. We were in this eyewall for 10 minutes. And so the video I've shared, and it was like distributed a bunch, was like a 2-minute and 20-second clip, but that was from a 10-minute video that I filmed of us just getting bounced around in the eyewall of Ian. And I think in that 2-minute video, at one point I say, like, we've got to be coming out of this, because at that point I'm like, this has been going on for a while. And it wasn't just the up and down turbulence, but there was a lot of lateral, like, rocks to the side, which are not as common and are certainly much more uncomfortable than the just up and down stuff.
Yeah. At what point were you like, I should take out my phone and start filming this? Or do you always kind of film when you're going through the eyewall?
Yeah, I try to film when I'm on the aircraft, especially with P3, because that's you can film a lot of exciting things. And specifically on that flight, I wasn't actually the operator launching the dropsons and the drones. My role on that aircraft was sort of like project management, to make sure that everyone knew what we were doing with the drone, because it was still a new system for us. to make sure that we were following checklists, following procedures for this new thing that we were doing. And so I was just sitting across from the person who was actually launching drop zones, doing all of that. And I didn't have much to do. And so I just had my phone out filming the pass through. And what a pass it was.
Do you guys get scared? Like, was that a situation where you were like, I'm fearful for my life? Or are you so used to it at this point that it was just kind of a wild ride?
So I'll say that the first time you fly through a hurricane, certainly you have more butterflies in your stomach, more fear, because you've never done it before. But you do this for a number of years, and then you also understand the amount of work and the amount of training and professionalism that goes into the crews on these aircraft, the pilots, the meteorologists, everybody on board is there to do a job, and they do it very well. And so you just have nothing but faith in the folks up front at the controls flying the aircraft that you're going to be okay. And you also have faith in the aircraft itself. I mean, these P3s are almost 50 years old at this point, and they're still just trucking through hurricanes year after year. And so you don't think about that too much. That flight in particular, especially with like the lateral sways and the hits we were taking, it was a little more unsettling than normal. But I wouldn't say it's, scary.
For you.
Yeah. Well,
a few things, you must get on a commercial aircraft and be like, these people are nuts when people freak out about turbulence, right? Like, that's nothing. Chump change.
Yeah, I mean, I think the worst turbulence I've experienced on a commercial flight was like landing in Detroit in the wintertime a couple of years ago. And it was pretty bumpy coming in. We were coming through a cloud layer. And like some people are screaming, and the lady beside me is like, holding on to her armrest. And it's like, we're okay.
I need to sit next to you on an airplane. I need that kind of reassurance. Okay, so at that point, I was reading the AMS article the other day. You said that was the worst turbulence you've ever felt on one of these missions. Does that hold true still today?
Still today, yeah. Well, I only flew a couple of storms last year, so not much has changed since Ian. I will say that you'll get a different answer from different people that you talk to at our office. And so, like I think it was 2021 Hurricane Sam, we were doing a research mission out in the Atlantic, and the aircraft at one point dropped like 1,500 feet in a very short amount of time. And so you'll talk to some people and they'll say, well, that was my worst flight doing this. The people who were on the Ian flight will say it was Ian. Some people will talk about Hurricane Patricia in 2014. So it all just depends. Everyone has their worst.
What do you talk to the pilots like during or after? Like, what's their take on this? Are they like, oh yeah, that was a fun challenge, or were they like, that was interesting and scary?
We I mean, after every flight, we have a quick debrief, just talk about how things went, and especially after that Ian flight, they were tired. It was a lot of work to keep the aircraft level and all of that. So luckily, like I said, that was our last mission of that storm, and so we had a down day the next day to kind of recover, and then once the storm had passed Florida, we flew the aircraft back, and then we're standing by until the next one.
Do you remember at that point what the category and wind speed was within Ian?
So that morning, it was rapidly intensifying, and briefly, while we were in there, reached Category 5, very briefly, but it had weakened back down to Category 4 by the time it made landfall in Fort Myers. But the thing is, Category 4, Category 5, like a high-end Cat 4, at that point, it's going to cause devastation no matter what. And so we try to emphasize that that's the whole reason that we do this, is to get into the storm, to get the in-situ data so that the forecast models can be as accurate as possible. And without that, you don't get nearly as much warning about the track and the intensity of the storm. And so it very much matters to people on the ground.
Yeah, and there's so many ways that you're getting information into the storm now too, between drones and sail drones and buoys. And
oh yeah.
Yeah. And so on board, and when I was watching the video, I was kind of curious, safety wise, what it looks like. Some people like were wearing harnesses, and then other people, I couldn't even tell if they were wearing seatbelts. So are you guys like strapped in good when you're out there?
Yeah, so we every seat has a 4-point harness. So it's got the lap belt and then the 2 straps that come over the shoulders. A lot of folks up front will wear all 4. Usually the drops-on operator in the back usually only has the lap belt on because they have to turn around. They have to reach for expendables. And so it can be a little difficult to do that with the shoulder harnesses. But when we're in turbulence, we set what we call condition 5. We set that for takeoff and landing, and then turbulence, and that's where everyone is sit down, everyone has their seatbelts on. And then as for other things in the aircraft, we try to stow things and strap things down as best we can.
There's like that box of drops-ons just like hanging out.
Yeah, so that box of drops-ons was, secured to the floor with a ratchet strap over the top of it. And with the turbulence of the aircraft, that box tilted over out of its ratchet strap. The bunks in the back where the pilots and the flight engineers will get some rest on the flight. Normally there's seat belts for those that normally keep those in the rack, and I guess they just hadn't been buckled, and so those came out. There is a coffee pot in the back. It is secured to the dinette back there. The top of that popped off. People's bags with like shoes and stuff that were stored underneath where the racks were had come out. And so we do what we can to secure the aircraft, especially when we know we're going to get in turbulence, but sometimes you just get in a pretty rough patch.
That's like a little cleanup when you guys land.
Yeah, it was. So we did that pass, we get into the eye, and we're planning to launch the drone in the eye. And so we're circling, but the wind field was such that even in the eye, we were hitting winds of like 110 knots at flight level. And this was, we're trying to do as tight of a circle as we can to stay out of all of that so that we can launch this drone and get out of here. And so even after we got into the eye, normally you could get a couple of minutes at least of reprieve and go clean up whatever you need to do. But in the storm, it was just, all right, let's get this thing out and get out of here. And so once we had popped out on the east side, and we're working our way back around, that's when we were able to get up out of condition 5, go back, clean up the coffee. Certainly made a mess, though.
Yeah. But it's a good thing you got the drone in there because there's been some research. This happened almost 2 years ago, but since then, there's been some research by you and some of your colleagues, right, about this particular flight. So can you tell me about what came out of this drone data that was in this storm?
The beauty of these uncrewed aerial systems that we've been testing the last couple of years is that they can get to the parts of the storm that are too dangerous for us to get to in an aircraft to collect data that we otherwise wouldn't be able to get. And a lot of that is especially down at low altitudes in what we call the air-sea interchange. It's where all of that energy is being soaked up out of the ocean by the storm and turned into kinetic energy and winds. And all of that interaction happens at low altitudes. And so the lowest we'll fly through a hurricane is 5,000 feet above the water. And these drones can get down to 30 feet above the water. And so the drone we launched, I think at one point it recorded a gust of like 216 miles per hour at like 2,000 feet above the ocean. And that was a violent part of the eyewall. And it continued to descend down in its pattern, collecting all of that low-level data for us. And we've got more of those. We've got different science modules planned for this year, not just to drop them in the eye, but to also drop them in the moats, working their way into the storm. So there's a lot of different research that they're trying to do with it. Our office specifically, we're just the operators. And so we don't really end up looking at the data or analyzing it or coming up with scientific theories. We're really just the ones who get out there, deploy the instrumentation, and get everybody safely back home.
I know you guys do media flights too. Have you ever flown where there's been a member of the media on board, and what is their reaction to this type of flight?
So everybody reacts differently. So on that Ian flight, sitting behind me was a photographer from CBS, And that guy was having the time of his life. He was really enjoying it. I've seen other folks, whether they're from the media or VIPs or whatever, they can get sick. I got sick on my first flight into Hurricane Matthew in 2016. I was not deterred.
But were you embarrassed? It feels like that's like a newbie thing where you trying to like keep it together.
I've done a lot of those things. I've done a lot of things this job to be embarrassed. But getting sick, I mean, everybody has gone through that at some point. And what sold the job for me is that even though I was sick on that Matthew flight, I was able to compose myself enough during one of the passes through the eye after the sun had come up to just look out the window instead of just, trying to hold my life together. And just seeing that the eye of a hurricane for the first time, I was hooked. It didn't matter how sick I was going to get used to it. And here I am 8 years later.
So you're going to keep flying. You're not intimidated by this turbulence at all.
No, I mean, I love this job. I love the kind of work that we get to do. Flights like Ian, I'll certainly never forget. But our aircraft are ready for hurricane season this year. However many storms there are, doesn't matter. If there's research value or if they're threatening lives and property, we're going to go fly them. We're going to collect the data. We're going to do what we always do.
Now here's my talk with Dr. Joshua Wadler from Embry-Riddle. So this video came out a couple of years ago of this crazy bumpy flight as you and the team of hurricane hunters are flying through Hurricane Ian. And fast forward a couple of years here, and you've now come up with this equation to kind of show just how bumpy this flight was. And turbulence is a big talker right now. So I really want to get a feel for where you kind of got the prompt to do it. Was it this flight that made you think, I need to quantify this?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So while we're on the flight, sitting next to the person, I'm sitting next to the person next to me, and that person has been flying for, 10, 15 years maybe. And we're like, wow, that was really bad. And, I'm asking, I've only been flying, maybe 5 years or so. I was like, that's the worst I've ever experienced. What about you? And he was like, yeah, I've never experienced anything like that before. And it was unique in the sense that the plane was going like side to side a lot. And in a hurricane, you expect to go up and down. You can even lose or gain 1,000 feet in a couple seconds. It's not abnormal. But the side to side accelerations were really weird. And so we were talking and we were like, oh, that was bumpy. Those flights are bumpy, but how do you actually rank them? And so we tried to come up with a physics first principle way to do so. And that's what motivated the project.
Okay, so what was your role on that particular flight?
So that mission was unique in the sense that we launched our Altea 600 UAS for the first time. So that's a small UAS. It's about 27 pounds. And we've been working for years to make this deployable inside our storm. So I'm on that team.
Okay. And for people who don't know, like drone, basically, right?
Drone, yeah. Small drone. It's really fascinating work. We drop an airplane out of another airplane. So just imagine that. And it flies. And so really, really cool stuff. And so we deployed for the first time into Ian right before it made landfall. It actually set the world record for longest duration UAS in a hurricane. It's in the Guinness World Record.
So that flight was notable for so many reasons, but it kicked off this research that you started, and you recently presented this research at an AMS conference, right? So what were the findings?
So what we did is we created this equation, and then we applied this equation to every flight into a hurricane since 2012, and then we ranked them. And we ranked them based on the maximum bumpiness experienced in a flight. And that flight, Hurricane Ian, in 2022, came out as the bumpiest flight over that time frame.
It really surpassed all the others, right? Can you kind of take me through the scale and where it ranked compared to like number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on the list?
Yeah, I think it was about 30% worse than the second place. I don't have the exact number. I could pull it up. But it was about 30% worse than the second place flight, which is, I mean, it was bad. It confirmed exactly what we were thinking. It's very hard to compare flight to flight over different years, but it was, we were bouncing around, that's for sure.
So what were some of the other noteworthy flights?
Irma from 2017, Hurricane Sam was another big one. Typically, the stronger the storm, the more bumpy the flights are, was a recurring theme.
Had you personally been on many Hurricane Hunter flights?
I've been on a few. I've been flying since 2017. I think I have about 12 or 13 eyewall penetrations at this point. So nowadays with the UAS, I fly a few times per year. And the main reason I fly is when we deploy our drones.
So were you scared on that flight? Do you guys ever get scared on those flights?
That was a little scary for sure. So the fun part, or I guess the scary part, was the bumpiness was before we released our drone. So a lot of times, even in turbulence, when you're busy, you don't notice it. I've actually been through a few strong eye walls where I didn't even realize it because I was just doing stuff and processing data, looking at data. But this was before we launched the drone. And so we were definitely paying attention to it, which made it feel pretty scary.
Yeah, and Nick kind of commented on not just the kind of bumpiness factor, but the length of time too. Did you notice that?
Yeah, it was definitely I would say about 10 minutes of bumpiness. The equation that we came up with for the ranking is based on the maximum at one time. So the biggest bump ever experienced. We are working on another algorithm to have a cumulative effect. So something that would take into account bumpiness over 10 minutes or something like that. But it was just the maximum bumpiness for 1 second, maximum 1 second.
Wow. Okay. And then you also ranked the spots on the plane as far as bumpiness. I'm curious where you are sitting, and can you explain how you figured out that ranking?
So I liken this to a few different problems. And so the first problem is the elevator problem. And so those are for translational motions. And so if you have an elevator, say, accelerating upward, everyone on the elevator experiences it the same. However, imagine you're on a thing that rotates, like in a park, like a carousel. The farther back you are in the carousel, the more you're going to feel that rotation, right? It's going to feel more intense. And so the closer you are to the center of the plane or the center of gravity, the less intense the bumpiness is because you don't feel those rotational motions. And so we put those two things together. We put the translational motions and the rotational motions, and we put them together. And so the people that at the edges of the plane tend to feel the worst of it. And actually, I was on the seat that ranked the least bumpy of any seat on the entire flight, which I thought was hilarious. Given the experience, but the pilots had it the worst.
And then obviously the back of the plane, because I heard about how the bunk fell down and the coffee went flying, right?
Yeah, it's not uncommon for coffee to go flying on the plane. So that's actually one of the biggest hazards is people getting burned from hot coffee going flying. And that actually typically happens in weaker storms because in strong storms, when it's coming, you're going into the eyewall very well organized. In weak storms, you might be, halfway out going into the storm and you just hit something you don't expect it. And That's actually, it's a different type of hazard, I guess.
So is this equation used solely for the purpose of like forensic analysis post-storm, or is it something that can be used prior to a storm as a forecast?
Yeah, there's a lot of uses for this. So right now there are turbulence algorithms out there, but they're mainly for characterizing the state of the atmosphere. And so what we wanted to do is characterize the human experience. So it's a little bit of a different motivation. And so one of the applications of this is cognitive ability. And so for example, let's say you're in extreme turbulence for an extended period of time. What's the ability of someone to make a quick decision? And how much do you trust that decision, or how long does it take for us to recover from what our brain goes through during extreme turbulence? And so that's definitely like the 5-year project associated with this.
And then do you ever foresee this being used on commercial aircraft?
Absolutely. Yeah, I could definitely see that. I could definitely see that application. I could see it on general aviation, private aircraft, all types of applications. And, mainly for, cognitive ability and decision-making. How do people respond to turbulence and so on?
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems like a science where there's a lot of work still yet to be done. Is that what you think as well?
Yeah, I would say so. This is all new to me. I'm a meteorologist by training, and so this is pretty new to me. But certainly, I would say there's a lot of work in terms of safety and applications of safety, which is a big thing right now.
Yeah, and there's been some research too on climate change and turbulence getting worse in climate. Is there any is that taken into account at all in this equation, or is that something you'll have to think about in the future?
It's not taken into account directly, but certainly if bumpiness were to be worse in a changing climate, that would show up in the bumpiness algorithm if you were applied to data from any plane.
Josh, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Off the Radar is a production of the National Weather Desk. Make sure you're following the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes published every Tuesday morning. If you like this episode, please share it with a friend. There's a previous episode you can also check out about turbulence and climate change. Make sure you also check out the National Weather Desk's YouTube page for our newly released Hurricane Special. You'll hear all about those drones being dropped out of the Hurricane Hunter aircraft that you hear both of the guests talk about today. Big thanks to NOAA Hurricane Hunter Nick Underwood and Dr. Josh Wadler from Embry-Riddle for joining me on the show. For the National Weather Desk, I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie. Make it a great day.